All right, everybody, Mike Cohen here with you, Sports Talk Nation. We are back talking baseball as the winter meetings about to get into high gear here this week. The Mets, of course, at the center of attention in a lot of ways because of what moves may or may come here for the Mets, as they have two of the biggest free agents on the market right now, in Edwin Diaz and Pete Alonso. Let's get right into it. So, of course, all this is kind of a way for me to kind of catch up because I didn't get a chance to do a video on the Devin Williams signing. Obviously, that happened last week with the Mets signing Williams to a 3-year, $51 million contract to be the setup man, at least at the moment, depending on what happens with Edwin Diaz. Now, initially, when they made the move for Williams, I was kind of skeptical because you have Williams coming off of a bad year with the Yankees where he had an ERA of, around 4.79, but when he was the closer, really struggled. At one point in the month of April, had an ERA over 11. That's how badly he was struggling in the closer's role. And twice last year, lost that closer's job, eventually losing it to David Bednar, whom the Yankees acquired at the trade deadline. So when I see the Mets go out there and they sign Devin Williams and still have Edwin Diaz out there as a free agent, my initial thought was like, what's this? What's going on? Does this mean the end of Diaz in a Met uniform? It may or may not. Depends on how things transpire here over the next several days, maybe even weeks, depending on how quickly this gets done, or whether Diaz can find a reasonable suitor for the contract that he's asking for. But when you look at this Williams deal, it does a couple things for the Mets. One, when you step back and really look at it, it's financially sound because, yes, even at $17 million a year, if you include deferments, that comes down to a little less than $15 million a year. So he's making about $14.9 million. That's not bad. That's right around the ballpark for a setup guy. And also, with Williams, he does have a track record of pitching well in that setup role. And if you have him and Edwin Diaz, my goodness, what a finish to a ball game that the Mets have in the 8th or 9th inning potentially. That's why, to me, if the Mets can sign Edwin Diaz, it's really a must. If they're going to be competitive and win this year in 2026, okay, they're better off with Edwin Diaz in that bullpen than, let's just say, doing the baseball analytic thing and saying, hey, look, you have Williams. He's making about $15 million a year, which if he is your closer would be on the cheap end because you take Diaz, who's asking for about $20 to $22 million a year. So you're getting Williams at a cheaper rate of saving about $7 million there on that regard. And then you could piecemeal different pieces of like Tyler Rogers and other guys you can find for that bullpen. I totally understand that. I get it. You can get creative in that sense. But I'd rather still have Edwin Diaz over any of these other guys and Diaz and Williams together than Williams just by himself. So that's how I feel about that situation right now with regards to the Diaz situation. Now, Diaz is 32. He's looking for another 5-year contract, which is the reason why he opted out of that previous deal. I mentioned the money that he's looking for, the AAV of around $22 million a year. So we'll see who blinks first, whether it's the Mets or Diaz. I would like to see the two of them come into the middle. I think John Heyman even mentioned it in one of his reports this week that the Mets are at 3 years and Diaz wants 5 years. They have to find a way to come into the middle here. Find a way. Make a 4-year contract, something that makes sense. You want to pay a little more upfront, $20-21 a year in the first couple of years of the contract. I totally understand that. But the Mets, if they're going to be real, if they're going to be serious about playing, serious games in September and October this year, you would have to imagine that bringing back Edwin Diaz is part of that plan. I will say this about Williams: if there's a situation where Diaz does leave, and that's possible because the Toronto Blue Jays are another team linked to him, Williams, the Mets are betting that Devin Williams has a bounce back year similar to what Edwin Diaz had with the Mets, because Diaz's first year in New York was bad. 5.59 ERA his first year in 2019. Really, you compare the two of them stat by stat, very similar. 67 games for Williams last year, 66 games for Diaz back in 2019. I mentioned the high ERAs. The strikeouts were eerily similar as well, around 98. And both of them really struggled to handle at the time the pressure of New York. For Williams, he was coming over from Milwaukee after so many years as a successful setup man and closer for the Brewers when he came to the Yankees last year via trade. So he felt the pressure, and it didn't work out. Diaz, of course, in that big trade back in 2019, the Mets got him. That Kelenic trade that, at the time, everyone hated. And then, of course, he struggles that year. The Met fans, of course, get angry. But eventually, he figures it out and becomes this superstar closer for the Mets with Narco. That has become a cultural phenomenon with him coming out of the bullpen. The seemingly spotless ERA at 1.63, capping it off last year. Reliever of the year last season in 2025. Certainly over the last 3-4 years, Edwin Diaz has become a huge part of the Mets' success and really a fan favorite. So the hope for the Mets would be is if it's Williams closing by himself this year, that he can kind of replicate that. We'll have to wait and see. But the biggest thing is, if the Mets can get Diaz back here, they should try to do that as best they can. Now, of course, the other big ticket out there is Pete Alonso, and the rumors are that Boston is in on him, that he is high on the Red Sox list, and the Red Sox are high on his list. He wanted, and I remember, watching other analysts throughout the week this week, whether it be on SNY, Baseball Night in New York, and SNY, and the talk is that Alonso wants 6 to 7 years, and now we're seeing here. Now we're seeing from Joe Sherman of the New York Post that Alonso may have a hard time getting such a contract. In fact, as he reports here, I don't think the length is out there for Alonso, an AL official told Sherman. One veteran agent offered to the Post no one is giving him 5 years. He would be lucky to get 4, and that will likely come with a lower AAV, average annual value, and a whopper of deferred dollars. So Alonso right now is looking for about certainly north of $30 million a year, right? Which would certainly put him past Vlad Guerrero Jr., who signed that big contract at the early part of last season with Toronto. So who's going to do that? Certainly, we know Steve Cohen has the money to do that, but do they want to do that? To me, even more than Edwin Diaz, as much as I'd like to see Edwin Diaz be here, Pete Alonso is almost a must, in my mind, for the Mets, because the alternatives are, while they are tempting, it's a lot just to replace one player. And I'll get into that here, because you have Pete Alonso, who in my mind last year was the Mets' best player in 2025. 38 home runs, 120 RBIs. He had a lot of big hits early, especially early in the season. He took a lot of pressure off of Juan Soto when he was struggling in that lineup. Big hits, of course, the big home runs in the playoffs, now almost going on 2 seasons ago in 2024. Ironically, one of them, of course, off of Devin Williams now, when he was with Milwaukee in that NLDS. But he is, of course, a face of the franchise. He is one of those guys that you would have to consider a cornerstone player. I would hate to see the Mets lose him. And I know that David Stearns wants to go out there and say that you can't bring back the same team. I get that. And I know this team has underachieved severely last season, whether it be clubhouse turmoil with this weirdo story with, Lindor and Soto and McNeil, make of it what you will, whether it be something else in the clubhouse, whatever it may be, things just did not go well for the Mets last year, of course, not to mention the moves that David Stearns made last season that did not pan out. We can go chapter and verse on that as well. Fact is, the Mets, much like with Edwin Diaz in the back of the bullpen, are a better baseball team if Pete Alonso is in the middle of the order, because the alternative is this. If Alonso does leave, let's just say for Boston, then what are the Mets going to do? You could go out there, you could bring in Kyle Schwarber, who had 56 home runs last year, was an NL All-Star, NL MVP, had a great year last year with the Philadelphia Phillies. Great, he's your DH. Who's playing first? Is Mark Vientos? Do you want to have Mark Vientos? Are you ready to see Mark Vientos at first base 159 games a year? If not, do you also bring in Cody Bellinger, another former Yankee, who can play left field, can play center field, and a little bit of first base, but only played 7 games of first base last season for the Yankees? Do you really want to go that route? So you're basically having three players, Bellinger, Schwarber, and Vientos, replacing one guy in Pete Alonso. I don't know. Not to mention, Schwarber's going to get a big contract, probably north of, $35 million a year, we'd have to imagine, especially coming off the year that he had last year. But the thing about Schwarber is, as great as a power hitter as he is, he's only a .231 career hitter. And compare that to Alonso, who is a .253 hitter, who hit .272 last year, and it can balance your lineup out. Instead of having a lefty-dominated lineup, I'd rather have Alonso. Nothing against Schwarber, who's a great hitter in his own right, but I want some balance in the lineup. If you bring in Schwarber and Bellinger, let's just say for the sake of argument, to basically replace one player, you would have a lefty-dominated lineup of Lindor, who is, I think, a better hitting left-handed than he is right-handed as a switch hitter. Soto, who's hitting left. You would have Schwarber, who's a left-handed hitter, and then Bellinger's a left-handed hitter. You wouldn't get to a right-handed hitter until Mark Vientos and Francisco Alvarez. Where's the balance in the lineup? So that's why I think Pete Alonso is very important in that regard. And the Mets have talked about run prevention. And I know Pete Alonso is not exactly Keith Hernandez out there at first base. I get it. Kyle Schwarber's not a first baseman. He's the DH. Cody Bellinger by trade is more of an outfielder than he is an infielder, although he can play some infield. Again, what are you trying to do defensively for run prevention? If you're talking about run prevention, I want someone I know who could be out there at first consistently every day. And yes, even while he is not perfect at first, I still would rather have Pete Alonso back there. So we'll see what happens here, folks. These are the two biggest moves of this offseason pending for the New York Mets, where both Alonso and Diaz end up. And it's not this. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if the Mets end up with a Kyle Schwarber, Cody Bellinger dual threat signing here because Alonso walks, or they feel that they can get lower value, if you will, better value instead of paying Alonso, 5 or 6 years, whatever excuse they come up with. Not saying they can't win this year, but it's going to be a bit of a challenge. It will be a bit of a challenge. As far as starting pitching is concerned, there's all kinds of talk about Framber Valdez, a trade there. Talk about maybe the Mets throwing in Jonah Tong in a deal potentially for Minnesota's Joe Ryan, who is a decent pitcher. I mean, he's more of a number 2 or number 3 guy. I wouldn't exactly call him an ace. So these are all these kind of rumors that are out there for the Mets. But I think right now, if you are a Mets fan, you want to see the Mets, as we start these winter meetings, give you some closure on what's going on here with Alonso and Diaz. One way or the other. Just get it done. One way or the other. Because if the Mets do lose one or both of those guys, they're going to have to get very creative in trying to replace them. And that is something to be concerned about. Now, also this. And we could also, as much as we want to be critical of David Stearns and his moves last offseason, and even last year at the trade deadline, Ryan Helsley, of course, comes to mind, and Cedric Mullins comes to mind. Keep in mind that in 2027, we're not guaranteed of a baseball season that year because of the labor strike and the talk of a potential salary cap. Right now, the Mets sit here with a projected total allocation of current payroll right now of $236 million. That's our current payroll. About 2/5 of that is Juan Soto and Francisco Alvarez at about $94 million combined, the two players. So if you had another $31 million for Pete Alonso, and then you throw in, let's say, another $20 to $22 million for Edwin Diaz, that's a lot of your salary. It's probably going to push you well north of $300 million over the next several years on just 4 play, with a lot of that going to 4 players, a big chunk of it to 4 players, and we don't know what the result of that labor dispute is going to be going into next year, and what the salary cap may be, and there may have to be a lot of adjustments in deferred money. So I'm certain that that's playing a big role in this. I know it is. So we'll have to wait and see how this thing plays out. But for right now, as we sit here, as we begin these winter meetings, get the Diaz and Alonso deals done. I think it's if the Mets, it's probably the best thing for the Mets right now, certainly in the near term. I understand the Mets want to sit there and they want to look at a lot of young guys, but let's get these guys back in the fold. Let's see what happens. Like and subscribe. We'll talk to you next time.